my niece says it's time to sit down, so.
So this sermon was originally written to be my last sermon down in Florence, Alabama. I spoke down there pretty regularly over many years, usually about once a month. Last year I reduced that to once a quarter and then decided that I was tired of writing sermons and driving 2 hours each way to speak. They're a great bunch, but it's getting into full retirement. So some of what I write, I'm still going to reference why I wrote what I wrote and how I was addressing them, but I'll also bring it up to date. While I was down there, we went through COVID together, and they did it differently than we did it. They opened up much earlier because they said if we don't open, we're just going to fall apart and die. They didn't have the audio-visual capabilities of doing it online. So I gave a couple sermons wearing a mask, as did everyone else. Now, wearing a mask is annoying enough, but imagine you're in a room with no loudspeakers or anything, and you're trying to get that volume up so everyone can hear you, and then it's... So we went through that 2 or 3 times, and I said, I'll keep coming, but you got to let the speaker do it without a mask. It's just too much for me. I'm an old man. So we did get through it all, and what passes for normal slowly returned. And I have many fond memories of being down there. This was given last November, and that was probably the last sermon I'll be giving down there. It's not the last sermon, I suspect, that I'll be giving here, but I'll probably have to write something again and get back into that. And it was kind of hard to write this one because I had some sermons that I had given here that I had not given down there, so it had been months before I actually had to sit down and write something. And it was a lovely warm day in October. We were dog sitting my son's 2 puppies. We had gotten 2 puppies earlier in the year, so these 4 puppies are outside growling and biting and wrestling and running and crashing while I'm trying to focus on writing a sermon. And it's much more fun to stop and look at the dogs playing than actually having to put words to computer screen. But I got through it. And it had been a long, hard spring and summer, and some of you have heard some of this, but my parents are both wrestling with severe illnesses. My mother has Alzheimer's. My father has a very rare disease called amyloidosis, which means his body produces mutant proteins that don't filter properly and attach to his organs. And it's usually not diagnosed till you've seen about 5 doctors because it's super rare. And he went through a lot of chemo-like treatment, lots of doctor's appointments in Nashville, and he couldn't drive himself. So my sister and I are constantly shuttling our parents to the hospital, and he felt terrible all year. Hasn't felt good till about the last week. We may finally have turned a corner of sorts. So I'm going through all that, and then I sit down and I'm going to write my last sermon. And I said, well, I have to conclude somehow. I can't just do any old sermon. I got to give final thoughts because I'm not coming back here, most likely. And as I'm sitting down to write, I'm thinking about some of the conversations I've had with my father. My parents are strict fundamentalist Christians, but as death approaches, and death is a very real specter now, my dad and I were able to have some very open and candid and often humorous conversations about death. Gallows humor is a very real thing, and my dad and I have a lot of jokes about his probably imminent death. That may sound a little grim, but you can either do that or you can just feel depressed all the time. So we laugh a lot in the car as we talk about all the horrible things he's going through. And he still wrestles with a lot of things. His teachings, on the one hand, are the Bible is perfect, inerrant Word of God. No errors, exactly what God had to say. And yet, he's encountering Universalist thought that everyone gets saved. And it's not from me, but from other people around him. And his response is, but Jesus talked about hell. And if people aren't going to hell, then Jesus was wrong, or the Bible's not accurate, and I just can't go there. So he always hits that wall. He can't move past it. It's kind of sad. But he is nonetheless thinking things he never even used to allow himself to think. And that's encouraging. And that's going to tie directly into what I share with you. What are these final profundities? I was either lay minister or minister here for almost 10 years. Did a lot of reading, a lot of sermons, a lot of thinking. What great wisdom can I relate to you today? Prepare to be disappointed. Because that's one of the things I learned is, no matter what outfit they're wearing, no matter what titles they have, they're just another person like you, and they're struggling through things just like you are. And even the most exalted religious leaders, probably in the deep, secret conversations they have, will admit there's a lot they don't know. And they put on a good front. They feel like they have to. They don't want to let the other people down. So I have been encountering some very interesting, and what I would dare say to be powerful ideas recently from a wide range of sources. And sometimes the same idea comes at me from very unrelated books or videos or just chatting with people. And I'm going to share some of those today. One of these things certainly comes out of the Zen tradition, but I'm hearing it from non-Zen traditions. And this is that humans need to think of themselves not as individuals separate from everything else in the universe, just sort of flowing through the universe in your lifespan, but nonetheless separate and detached. And rather, it's much more helpful to think of yourself as a temporary expression of the universe, one of an infinite number of expressions that we call people, places, things, planets, galaxies. All of these things, the universe intruding into what we call our dimension or our reality. I'm going to share a couple of quotes from two very different books that touch on this idea, and neither one has anything to do with Zen. The first one is a book called The Flip. It's by Jeffrey Kripal, Kripal. And this book is simply trying to get you to look at things differently. It's not a light read. I wouldn't say it's an academic book, but it's not a breezy read either. And his idea of consciousness is, and this is probably going to be a sermon down the road, we all think our consciousness, our understandings, our whatever it is we call I or me, comes from the brain. That the brain is generating all these thoughts and sensory inputs and sensory outputs. And that this is where consciousness comes from, the gray matter in our skull. And he says, well, think of it differently. Maybe consciousness is something totally separate from you physically, and your brain, rather than generating, is receiving. Think of it as a television. If you turn on the TV and watch a show, that box, or that flat screen, isn't generating the show. The show's coming from somewhere else and it's being broadcast. Think of your head or your consciousness as you have this brain that's like a radio receiver, and the consciousness is part of a universal consciousness, perhaps. And everything I share today is going to be speculation, so you don't have to believe any of it, but the ideas are intriguing. And what if your brain is picking up part of that and almost storing data like you store data in the cloud, off your iPhone or off your computer or something like that? And he says, if you think of it that way, this opens up all sorts of intriguing possibilities, like when your brain dies, it's just like your radio gets thrown in the garbage, but the radio broadcast is still going on. And maybe there's a consciousness still out there that you call you. It's just not being picked up by this body anymore. And so his quote is, it is possible that consciousness can cease to identify with any and all objects. And this is where he's referring to your consciousness doesn't have to identify with this physical body anymore. Interesting idea, and maybe it's true. The next book was a religious book by a man named Richard Rohr, R-O-H-R, for lack of a better term, a Christian mystic, or extremely liberal progressive Christian, well away from what we would normally call Christian. And his idea of the soul, or the consciousness, to try to tie these together, he says, let's think of a broader and deeper world where the soul has found its fullness and is finally connected to the whole, in this case, the universe, everything, and lives inside the big picture. So here's two people from completely different backgrounds, because Kripal's not writing from a religious perspective at all, and then a man who's writing from a Christian mystic perspective. And they're both saying the same thing. Your consciousness, or what you call you, needs to connect with everything. Now, if you hear a Buddhist say that, that's to be expected. But now you're hearing a Christian mystic and a essentially, secular scientist saying the same thing. I found it very interesting. I'm sure there's other sources that you can find the same idea. I think it really does tie back to many of the mystical traditions of religion, be it Christian or Muslims also have a very strong mystic tradition. And certainly the Jewish tradition does too, and then for Hindus and Buddhists, this is pretty much par for the course. So maybe there's some truth there. And it also seems to be the strongest counterpoint to the Abrahamic religions of the conservative variety, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, which really are fixated on the idea of an individual soul that survives death, has some kind of eternal life, or at least life after this life, but is separate from the rest of the universe. And it really brings to mind that I really haven't heard a starker contrast between a very prevalent worldview, especially in the U.S. If you ask someone about a soul, they almost always think this separate thing that resides in the body but is separate from and not connected to the rest of the universe. And then this other idea of maybe our consciousness survives us and does connect us to everything else. So that's the sort of thing I've been going through the last couple years, things I've been reading. And I keep bumping into this over and over, and I'm reading a fascinating book right now, and I'm not going to go into details, but it deals with materialistic perspectives and all existence being something other than what we normally think of as materialistic. And again, it talks about survival of death and what your consciousness is. So, that's it very simply, right? Things are much more complicated than you might have imagined. And maybe you don't have all the answers, and maybe no one does, and maybe it's a constant search for truth and meaning. We heard that before. So here's some conclusions I'm going to share. This is it. 62 years of life, 10 years of ministry, 4 years in a conservative Bible college, seminary at 2 different schools, endless books, and 3 years going to a very liberal Sunday school down the street at First Christian. And this is what I've got for you. Take it away and live life to its fullest. You're welcome. Number 1, people are far more in the dark than they let on. I'm trying to let on right now. As much as people like to believe they have the answers to the ultimate questions, those with the strongest beliefs tend to be those who really don't want to examine their beliefs with the possibility that they're wrong and that they have to change their deeply cherished beliefs. And the certainty of their worldview is almost always built on what other people have told them. And this goes back in an endless regression of people pretending to know more than they do, exuding self-confidence. I encountered this when I first entered Christianity. I had a lot of questions, and all these people at this church had absolutely solid answers. And as a young, impressionable teenager, I thought, well, surely they know, and I can trust them, because they're all saying the same thing, and they're saying it with absolute confidence. And then I learned better many years later. People say what they want to be true. They can convince themselves it's true. Absolutely, I had done that. But were they willing to examine those cherished beliefs by looking at contrary opinions and then having them clash and see if their beliefs still held up? They don't want that, and they don't want you to do it. When I was in Bible college, we were told, if you go on for a master's degree, you do not go to a secular school. And you do not go to those liberal seminaries like Vanderbilt Divinity School. They actually use that as an example, or Princeton Theological Seminary, because they will destroy your faith. And they're right. It probably will destroy your faith, because boy, they make you think. I went to Vanderbilt for a year, and the very first thing they did was, we're going to examine all your assumptions. List all your assumptions. And it was like, well, I sort of got rid of the assumptions, that's why I'm here. No, you still have assumptions. And they really hammered that point home. Let's take a look at the things you assume. Even if you're liberal, let's see what you assume. And they made you think. So that's number one. People are far more in the dark than they let on. Don't be deceived, and don't worry if you're not sure you know the answers, because you're in good company. Number two, live your life as though everything you do matters. Now, I got this idea from, and I do not endorse this guy, I've listened to him speak a lot, I find most of what he says just painful, but he is a darling of the right. Jordan Peterson was talking to Sam Harris, and they did a series of lectures together where they had deep, meaningful discussions, and it's just maddening sometimes. But he had a line I really like. Sam Harris says, you think God exists, right? And he said, no, I say you should live as though God exists. Now that doesn't answer the question, which God? But it does make you think, live as though. So what I like to do is live my life as though everything I do does matter. I've used the line that any good you do reverberates throughout the universe. This goes back to the notion that maybe you are connected to everything else. And maybe the tiny little good thing you do that no one else knows about has a positive impact on everything. Now, I cannot prove this, and no one else can. But if you live your life as though that were true, without demanding that it be true and without demanding that anyone else agree with you, that is going to have a positive impact on how you live. No, you may not be able to stop all the hatred and the discrimination and the just viciousness that we can find in this world, but every good thing you do may indeed reverberate throughout the universe. Every simple good thing you do has purpose. I like to use the example that I go and walk dogs at Animal Harbor, and no one knows and no one cares but the dog that I walk. And that good reverberates. That's how I live my life. I would encourage you to do that also. Your beliefs may drive your actions, and your beliefs may be different from mine, but live as though the actions matter. Not your beliefs, your actions matter. 3, institutional religion does far more harm than good. And this isn't just the conservatives, it's also the liberals. When a religion becomes powerful, or when people fight over positions of power, or when leadership feels like they can demand the followers believe a certain thing or do a certain thing, that's just a recipe for abuse, and it always has to be guarded against. That doesn't mean that every religion is bad. It doesn't mean that everything they do is harmful, but it does mean you have to be very careful. And that includes us in the UU world. There is a creeping creedalism, and if you don't know what that means, we are a non-creedal organization, a religion, where we do not say you have to believe X, Y, and Z. You don't read a statement of faith every Sunday or a creed every Sunday. We allow a wide range of diversity. Sometimes, at least at leadership levels, there is this creeping notion that, well, we can demand everyone believe this. Surely we can all agree that this must be true. Well, maybe not. Maybe you can welcome someone into a congregation that doesn't believe that. So you dare not say, we all believe this. And our principles avoid the word belief. We affirm and promote. We do not believe and demand others believe. You may believe it, but whatever it is, they chose the wording very carefully to allow people to have different beliefs and not feel unwelcome. So when religion becomes institutionalized, there is a grave danger that it also can become more harmful than good. So just be careful, because one need only watch what has happened to Christianity, that some forms of it have become Christian nationalism, have become this notion of we must be well armed and ready for the revolution. It's 1776 all over again. Get your guns, because Jesus was a big gun promoter, right? No, he wasn't. But there are verses that advocate for some kind of violence, even from Jesus. He said he came to bring the sword. And people will cling on to that and say, yeah, we're ready for the sword welding. Let's go take this country back. So we must watch out. Number 4, this one seems really obvious. Enjoy the life you have as best you can. Some religions want to make you feel guilty for enjoying things. And I have seen the extremes where such things as, these are all things that have been banned as sinful. Dice, cards, going to a movie. I mean, we're not talking the big sins here. We're talking about women wearing pants instead of a skirt. If that's what your religion has become, a list of don't do this, and this, all the joy is sucked out of it. And life just becomes this sort of training ground for the hereafter. And you just got to get through this really nasty, unpleasant part of it. And then you can get to the part you enjoy. And then you miss out on enjoying the life you do have. So don't let people steal that from you. Don't let people guilt you into doing things. And don't let people strip away happiness on the pretense of some kind of twisted morality or purity in God's eyes. I think you can probably figure out what's doing good in this universe and what isn't, and you can enjoy that process. Number 5, be honest with yourself and don't let others deceive you. If you encounter people who refuse to say, I don't know, you should probably give them a wide clearance. Be willing to acknowledge the things in your life you don't know, because there's so much we don't know, and so much we can learn, or at least explore. And you're just not going to know everything. You're not going to know a lot of things. And you're certainly not going to know the mind of God, whatever he, she, it, or they is thinking, or none of the above. So just be happy with the situation you're in and make the best of it. And don't let people take that away from you, and don't let people say, here's the truth. Allow me to give you the truth. Hopefully I'm not doing that right now. What I'm giving you is my opinion. I could be all wet on all 5 points. So be willing to learn and be willing to say, I don't know. It's the most honest answer. And when a minister refuses to say, I don't know, that's a church you probably don't want to go to. The ones who can say, yeah, I don't know either, probably more healthy. Now, I'm not sure what the future holds for me. As I said, probably not my last sermon. I'm going to try to help out more around here. But this was my concluding thoughts. as though it were my last sermon. But the things I can leave with you and things we can talk about in the next hour. I really doubt I'll be going down to Florence again. Like I said, 2-hour drives there and back just aren't as much fun as they used to be. I'm also entering that caretaker stage of life. As I mentioned, all the stuff I have to do for my parents. And of course, we are getting prepared for the inevitable death of one or both. They're both in their 80s, and they are both not in great health. So I have those things I'm dealing with. We're also going to be entering a time of change here. We're going to have a massive number of turnovers on the board. So far, only one returning, so a lot of new people who are going to try to help this church. I do want to thank our current board members. If you think about all we've been through the last few years, starting with the COVID mess, the hybrid service, the many iterations, endless hours put into wiring everything, getting things set up, training people. There's been a lot going on, and most of the board members were there for all those years. Not a lot of turnover on the board until now. And if they feel tired out and ready to let someone else do it, it makes sense because they've done a lot. And my thanks to all of you. So that's my accumulated wisdom. Make of it what you will. I don't know if any of it's right, but it is what I'm applying in my life, and you can take me to task in the next hour.